positive budget.
I'm getting the thumbs up from the back of the room, which means I think we are good to start. Well, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight at this panel on overseas aid and trade, fighting for social and environmental justice abroad. I'm Hannah Rich, I'm the Vice Chair of Christians on the Left and your chair for tonight, and we are delighted to be partnering with Sarah on this event. A small bit of housekeeping from me before we start. I will keep it to the minimum. We're obviously seeking to minimise the risk of the spread of COVID, so we are recommending people wear masks, but we're not going to enforce that. But disposable masks are available if anyone would like one. Also, when it comes to asking questions, Sarah's staff are going to be able to pass the mics around so we don't have to keep passing them around too much. I would also like to remind you that this event is being live streamed, and if you want to tweet, then the hashtags are hashtag Labour21, and also the handles for Sarah are at Sarah UK, and the Christians on the Left one is at CHR Left. That being said, I'm going to hand over to Ken from Sarah just to introduce the event briefly.
Hello, thank you very much everyone for coming to this event. We're delighted to partner with our fellow Socialist Society, Christians on the Left and World Vision and Tearfund on this really important topic. This is an issue that we've raised in the Labour Party and with our members. One of the things about Syria is we're committed, as I hope everyone in the Labour Party should be, to both climate justice and social justice. And our view is you can't have climate justice without social justice. We've raised this issues that are really coming up now, the issue of climate refugees, which is a real issue facing our country and will be growing ever more if we fail to address the climate crisis properly. Also, how we engage with leaders across the world now, like Bolsonaro, who are climate deniers, which I'm sure Emily might touch on. So, this is sort of we're Christians on the Left and overseas aid and trade and climate justice really coincide. We've got a massive programme of events this week. This is the third, I think, we've had, or the fourth today. You can see all of them on the Fringe app if you've downloaded that, or you can see in the Fringe guide if you prefer a paper-based one. And all that's left for me to say as well is if you do enjoy this meeting, and I'm sure you will, and if you do care about social justice and climate justice, Sarah, like Christians on the Left, is keen to make sure that we get people to join Sarah and add their voice to debate and discussion. So thank you very much, and I'll give this back to Emily.
Thanks, Ken. So I'm now going to introduce our panel for tonight. They're going to speak for 4 to 5 minutes each. That's 4-2-5, not 4T5. And I am going to enforce that. We're then going to hand over to you for questions. So be thinking about your questions while we hear from the panel. So we have a fantastic panel tonight of MPs and representatives from different international aid charities. So hopefully being able to bring together lots of different perspectives on the topic we're looking at. On my far left, I apologise for that. It's got to be done, and she did ask to not sit on that side. Well, okay. We are joined by Emily Thornberry, the Shadow International Trade Secretary. Emily is Labour MP for Islington South and Finsbury, as well as the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. She's held 5 Shadow Cabinet positions, covering briefs of Attorney General, Defence Secretary, Brexit Secretary, Foreign Secretary, and now International Trade. And in all of those shadow ministerial roles, she's led the parliamentary spotlight on the Conservative inaction on climate change. Next, we have Preet Gill, Shadow Secretary of Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, having previously served as junior opposition spokesperson for international development between 2018 and 2020, and has set out Labour's vision for international development and to achieve a sustainable world delivered locally. Representing the charities, we start with Mark Sheard, CEO of World Vision. Mark's been CEO of World Vision for almost a year.
About 18 months.
About 18 months, I do apologise, and served on the board for 9 years before that. And in 2017, I believe Mark was appointed by Archbishop Justin Welby to the Archbishop's Council of the Church of England, and so serves in a variety of roles, both in the church and within the charity sector. We then have Jennifer Larvae, UK Advocacy and Policy Lead for Christian Aid, another of the large aid agencies represented here today. Jennifer leads the UK Advocacy and Policy team with a focus on policy development and advocacy towards the UK government. She represents the organisation in the media and the political arena, and previously was head of Foreign Defence and International Development Policy at the Labour Party, so I'm sure has plenty to add to this conversation. And last but by no means least, we're joined by Claire Lyons, the co-leader of the Global Advocacy team at Tearfund. Claire oversees the strategic direction of Tearfund's policy and research work, UK and global campaigning. And prior to that was involved in Tearfund's campaigning on waste and the circular economy. And before joining Tearfund, she worked as a head of campaigns for CAFOD, for Save the Children UK, and has also worked for Christian Aid, the British Red Cross, and in local government. So I think the full set of charities that we could have represented, Claire has worked for. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask our panellists to speak to us tonight on their thoughts on this topic. And then, as I said, we'll hand over to you for questions. So Emily, would you like to go first?
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for Christians on the Left and for Sarah for organising this, and it's an honour to appear on this panel with so many of my friends and representatives of such important organisations. So I hope it's all right if I don't stand up, but if people at the back can't hear me or want me to stand up, I'm happy to, but I'm just going to, it's been a long day. I mean, it's really important that we do come together. This is a really important time. We know that. We know that we only have a few weeks, a few months left. We have to make sure that there really is action at COP. And the question is it going to happen? You know, what pressure can we bring about? And the truth is that, so you're going to get a lot. I mean, you hear it a lot, you know, of this sort of right-wingers who kind of just shrug their shoulders and just go, oh, well, what can we do? What can we do? You know, or you might hear from this government, you might hear, well, we have a plan to get to net zero as Britain, but what can we do internationally? And this hopelessness is frankly just as bad, in my view, as climate denial, because it means the same. It means that we're not going to do anything. Oh, it's impossible, we can't do anything. What can we do? You know, the Chinese are building all these power stations, or Brazil is burning the rainforest, or, you know, oil and gas exploration is thriving in the global south. So what can we do? But as I say, so I think climate change resignation is as bad as climate change denial, because in the end, it's an excuse. It's an excuse for apathy and inaction. So I have 5 things, right? 5 key ways that I believe that we could be doing in order to fulfill some of our obligations to tackle global emissions from BRIC economies and the global south, and the means to do so as well. And this is just, frankly, from my brief, right? There are many other ideas, but these are things the government could be doing now, and they're not. So, number 1, the first and the most obvious. You know, I was at Copenhagen. I heard the promises, the pledges that were made by the rest of the world to the global south, all the things that they were going to do, the ways in which they were going to give assistance in order to make sure that there was proper financial support in order to ensure that those economies could hit their own net zero and assistance to get onto that journey, but also in order to make sure that they were resilient, because they, of course, will be the ones who will be affected most by climate change. Number 2, and I'm sure that everyone understands this, especially in the UK, we're not just responsible for the emissions that we produce here at home, we're also responsible for all of those caused abroad. It's all very well for us to say, oh, we can get to net zero. We hardly have any manufacturing. It's done in China. You know, so actually, if you look at the G7 nations, which G7 nation has the most offshoring of carbon? It's us. And so there we are, you know, chairing the G7, chairing COP. Are we doing anything? Are we even leading any discussions on what we do about the offshoring of carbon? And what do we do in terms of making sure that those things are equaled out? What's the government's view on a carbon border tax? Has the government even said anything about it? Has the government even thought about it? No. It is irresponsible, and frankly, it is allowing others to take the lead. Third, I get sick and tired of people wringing their hands over Bolsonaro, you know, burning the Amazon, hoping that the next election in Brazil will go the right way, when we have corporations in our country who are complicit in the crime against humanity, because they are importing the crops and the raw materials that are being grown on that cleared land, on that land that has been stolen from indigenous people, sometimes at gunpoint. We need a proper due diligence law in our country, which makes corporations financially liable for any damaging deforestation taking place in their supply chains. And I mean any damaging deforestation, not just what Bolsonaro and other climate change denying leaders claim is against the law. We need to make sure that we have a proper definition of what deforestation means. Fourthly, we cannot claim that we have no say over fossil development overseas as long as UK exports are still, despite all the repeated promises, helping to fund fossil-related projects in the global south. And finally, the UK government must commit to reform the Energy Charter Treaty. The Energy Charter Treaty protects fossil fuel investors from curbs on their new developments in Europe, Central Asia, and elsewhere, and stops sovereign governments making decisions, responsible decisions about where we're going, about how we're going to get to net zero. They are taking governments to court on the basis of this. And when we challenge Liz Truss over what she's going to do about it, is she in favour of amending this? They still continue to sit on the fence. We are supposed to be global leaders. Do you remember? I don't know if you remember this. The beginning of the year, right, one of the things that Boris Johnson was saying was that this year, 2021, was going to be the year of British leadership internationally. Well, how's it going? What have they achieved in their year of international leadership? This is their last chance, COP. This is their last chance. We achieved nothing when it came to G7. Now is their chance. And here we are. I'm helping them out. I've got 5 suggestions for them. And they can show they can show international leadership. They can change change the weather. Too glib a phrase, but they could fundamentally change by having things which are achievable, which are real and can be delivered now. But we should be putting pressure on them and we should be moving beyond the rhetoric. Johnson's very good at rhetoric. We need some delivery. We need to have some real demands, and here we have 5. I'm sure that we will hear from many other people on the panel, but that's my starter for 5.
Brilliant. That was an exemplary use of 5 minutes. So I hope the rest of our panel will follow. And I should have mentioned at the start that we're delighted to have Emily with us tonight, but she may need to leave a little bit early. It's not personal. It's a very busy and long schedule, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. So next we have Preet Gill. I'm going to ask you to speak next.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you to Sarah. And it's wonderful that so many of our international NGOs are represented today. But it's great to see so many of you here as well, especially because this is the first time we're actually meeting in person. And it's wonderful to see so many people care about this issue. We all know, look, in the past 2 decades, climate-related natural disasters have affected 4 billion people, caused 500,000 deaths and displaced millions more. And we know climate catastrophes will displace millions of more people in the forthcoming years, but it's threatened the very existence of island nations and it's cost the global economy trillions of dollars. Developing countries, often the most threatened by climate breakdown, are actually the least responsible, but they are facing the triple challenge right now with a pandemic, which is exacerbating poor health systems. And we've seen so many countries just report the weak health systems, but of course in fragile states this is much, much worse. And then of course we've seen the inequity in terms of access to vaccines, which is deeply disturbing. And of course we've seen the climate and nature breakdown. And of course many of these countries are facing a debt crisis. The World Health Organization says that climate breakdown is expected to cause over 250,000 additional deaths per year between 2030 and 2050. And that will be through drought, it will be because of food insecurity or the growth in infectious diseases. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre reported that environmental disasters cause more than 3 times as many displacements than conflict in the years between 2008 and 2018, which included the mass migration seen out of Syria and North Africa. Climate change is a particular threat, though, to progress that has been made in the last decade in progressing the rights of girls. Because we know when environmental hazards that lead to crisis, it means that often girls have to drop out of school to help their families, and they are more likely to have an arranged child marriage to relieve some of the financial burdens. And girls are also more likely to experience violence and sexual exploitation, and less likely to have access to sexual and reproductive healthcare. But unfortunately, ahead of COP26, our reputation has been badly damaged by this government, both domestically and on international double standards, because we've seen the axing of our world-leading international development department. We've seen the decimation of our development expertise. You all would have seen we've lost 200 staff out of FCDO, many of them with a development background. And of course, following that, we saw the slashing of the aid budget for projects in places on the front line of the climate crisis, such as those in the Sahel region, which are vital. And of course, what is the message that this sends developing countries? It says that actually Britain is retreating. It's turning its back on the very people it should be advocating for at a time of a global pandemic. And it matters because if you don't have developing countries on side, you will not have the credibility for COP26 to succeed, because they can actually block agreements. So it's just an absolute, I know all of us are really, really angry about our government's direction of travel in respect of our position in the world. And none of us know actually what global Britain means under the Conservative government. The small international development charities have told us about the cancellation of a project which would have helped 1,500 people vulnerable to climate and economic shocks in remote northern Malawi. And they were receiving support for climate adaptive farming and community-owned tree planting and stewardship. There's been cuts to the plastic pollution-free Galapagos program, which would have helped address biodiversity loss in Ecuador, the world's second most important biodiversity hotspot, and support sustainable nature-based livelihoods. 3 years into a 5-year plan, the UK government have also cut a green growth programme designed to prevent deforestation and preserve Papua's 90% forest cover in the Indonesian Papua provinces. The programme focused on providing sustainable livelihoods to local populations, as a lack of alternative ways of making a living is often seen as a contributing factor to harmful environmental practices like deforestation. We now have a foreign and development minister who just a few weeks ago was quite happy to throw climate action under a bus in exchange for a headline trade deal with Australia, which I'm sure, I know Emily has been previously raising and doing a lot in this area. And this retreat really makes any hope of using COP26 to deliver on the ambition of the Paris Agreement and keep alive the hope of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels much, much harder. And in part because it directly removes support for programmes, but it also makes it harder to form a coalition of countries to pressure the biggest emitters. We believe the government should look to push the limits of what's possible in Glasgow, including leading by example domestically and building back greener to get us back on track to meet net zero and create jobs, seeking international agreement and NDCs with ambitious climate pledges, including a managed and fair phase out of fossil fuels across the globe, but also vitally important for many of the developing countries is helping mobilise the 100 billion climate finance that is needed for low-income countries and aligning public and private finance with the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thanks, Preet. Great. Well, following on this way, I'm going to ask Mark to speak to us now, and I believe it's going to have a video just perfectly timed there as part of that.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you to Sarah and Christians on the left, and thank you to Emily and Preet for setting the scene so clearly on this, for hosting this important and interesting panel discussion. I'm really grateful to you. As you probably know, World Vision is the world's largest Christian child-focused NGO. And so I really want to give us a very particular perspective this evening and look at this through the lens of the children and so on. There's never been a tougher time to be a child. The triple threats of COVID, conflict and climate change are converging to rob them of their childhoods and, unless we act now, rob them of their futures. And these threats intersect. Children are facing increased risks and deepening levels of vulnerability, inequality, displacement, hunger and poverty, as Preet was outlining. Nearly every child in the world is affected in some way by the climate crisis. But according to UNICEF, 1 billion children face an extremely high risk due to drought, flooding, and other climate-related impacts. Twice as many people are displaced by climate change as by conflict due to the impacts of flood, drought, food insecurity, and water scarcity. And the World Bank estimates that climate change could push more than 100 million additional people back into poverty by 2030. 100 million. And the risks for some children don't stop there. Globally, at least 1.6 billion children are living in a conflict-affected country, with approximately 426 million, or to put it another way, 1 in 6 children living in conflict-affected areas within those countries. 50% of the world's ever-growing number of refugees are children. In these areas, climate change is exacerbating pre-existing vulnerabilities and forcing children and families into dangerous and harmful coping mechanisms, as you explained, Preet. In East Africa, for example, an area already plagued by conflict, insecurity, climate change, and the impacts of COVID-19 are fueling a hunger crisis. Over 33 million people are acutely food insecure, 7 million being pushed to the very edge of starvation in countries such as South Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia. Climate change doesn't just destroy children's homes and their families' livelihoods through an increase in flooding and drought. It also threatens their food security and their nutritional development. It has ongoing and wide-reaching effects. To describe it as a crisis is probably too small a word. But there is hope. I bring you news of hope. When children and young people are involved in the issues which most affect their lives, they can make amazing changes. I want to introduce you to Ruth from Kenya. I can hardly talk about looking at the world through a child's eyes and then just tell you myself. So I don't know if we're going to hear Ruth, but we will certainly see Ruth. Thank you very much. I'm sorry the technical gremlins got in the way of the sound, but I think the message was fairly clear there. And it's an amazing message. Like I said, when children are empowered to be involved in decisions which affect their own lives, amazing things happen. So it's vital that we take children's involvement in climate change policy seriously and involve them in these decisions to find long-term solutions which bring climate justice to those who are most deserving. We know that climate justice is a global problem and it requires global solutions. It's not enough to put the responsibility on developing countries and on the shoulders of children who bear the least responsibility for climate change. That's why at World Vision, we're calling for the UK government to commit to ambitious climate change targets, which have the world's poorest and most marginalised at their heart. We can't do this alone, but we have to do this together. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Now over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks very much to no, I see you, Emily. Thanks very much to Christians on the left and to Sarah for putting this panel together. Indeed, the last time I was in Brighton, I was working for the Labour Party as head of international policy. It's a great privilege to work with Preet and Emily on the many issues that we are discussing on the panel today. And these are issues that Christian Aid and the Labour Party have strong and rich campaigning and policy records on. For the last 4 decades, Christian Aid has been working with partners and communities in countries across the global south, including Bangladesh, South Sudan, Kenya, and Malawi. These communities have faced the brunt of a brutal climate crisis that they did not cause. The reality is the world's richest countries have built their wealth on untrammeled pollution and fossil fuel growth. Not my words, but the words of, you'll never guess, Boris Johnson, speaking this week at the UN General Assembly. The reality is rich countries built their wealth on fossil fuel growth. So we have the Prime Minister of the 6th richest country in the world admitting that rich countries, through their trade and investment policies over centuries, through the exploitation of people and planet, are responsible for the climate breakdown we see today. What an admission. Climate change, like COVID-19, knows no national borders. We see extreme weather events hit Europe, the United States, and here on our own doorstep in the UK. But let's be clear, we may be in the same storm, but we're in very different boats. Rich countries are navigating this climate crisis on super yachts, whilst many developing countries barely have one oar. That's why for Christian Aid, the climate crisis is a crisis of justice. And at the heart of justice is money. As part of the Paris Climate Accords, the world's richest countries, including the UK, promised to deliver 100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020 to developing countries. 2 years on, almost 2 years on, this promise remains unfulfilled. And we now know with the extent of the crisis, that 100 billion was never going to be enough. So ahead of COP, Christian Aid is calling for 3 things. 1, for rich countries to pay their ecological debt to developing countries, deliver this 100 billion before Glasgow. Deliver this 100 billion in the form of grants and not debt. Don't raid existing development aid budgets to pay for this climate finance. That's not robbing Peter to pay Paul, that's just robbing Peter. Secondly, we're calling on rich countries to cancel the unjust debts hanging over developing countries. Debt cancellation is the fastest way to free up the much needed resources and fiscal space developing countries need to confront the triple crisis of the pandemic, poverty, and climate change. Lastly, we are calling for rich countries to compensate developing countries for the irreversible loss and damage climate change has already caused in many of these countries. In the communities that Christian Aid works with, the people that we work with, They won't be able to see loved ones that they've lost as a result of climate change. They won't be able to refill the streams and rivers that have dried up as a result of climate change. They won't be able to recreate the species and the animals so vital to their habitats and ecosystems that have been lost as a result of climate change. This package of money that we're calling for is not about charity, it's about justice. It's about rich countries paying the ecological debt they owe to developing countries. So for us at Christian Aid, that's what fighting for climate and environmental justice abroad looks like. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to the discussion in the Q&A.
And lastly, but very much not least, Claire.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And it's wonderful to be with you all today. I'm still getting used to being around people, so it's really great to be here. And at Tearfund, we work in 50 countries around the world, largely through churches, and we're all about people. We're all about movements of people. We're deeply embedded in some of the poorest communities in the world. And we have a bold vision, one which I'm sure everyone here would share. It's a vision of transformed lives for people living in poverty in a world where inequality is tackled and a world where we live within environmental limits. And we believe in a God of restoration. And because of that, we work with movements of people globally to play our part in that restoration story. And we do that by calling for change and also living differently. It certainly feels like we've got our work cut out at the moment. There's no doubt that we're in a series of crises. And the pandemic, as we've heard tonight, is a tragedy, but it's also a symptom of wider inequality and the environmental crisis. And as we know, the weight of suffering is falling on those who are already struggling to survive, those who've done the least to cause the problem. And pandemics like this will threaten us all more if we're not tackling climate change and the loss of biodiversity. So what can we do? Immediately in 2021, part of our mission is to take the opportunity given to us to press the reset button. Immediately at COP, we do need to get on track for a world where global warming is limited to 1.5 degree rise. We need to end the era of fossil fuels, and we do need to provide communities with the finance they need to adapt to this new normal. Accepting anything less than this from the COP summit is effectively a decision to accept and be content with the suffering of millions of people, both now and in the future. For the people that we work alongside, this suffering is a daily reality, and we've heard stories of that already here on the panel tonight. It made me sad to hear my colleague Norman in Honduras recently, who said that rain used to be seen as a blessing there. But after living through 2 hurricanes in the last year, the sound of rain is now a source of fear for him. The poorest 3.5 billion people are responsible for just 10% of the emissions that are released into the atmosphere, but these same people are already facing the worst impacts of climate change, having done the least to deserve it. And to go further, and I feel it's important to call this out, it is largely people in Black and brown majority nations who are worst affected by climate change. Climate injustice is racial injustice too, and this is something we should be speaking about as well. The time for talking about ambition is past. We're not talking about reaching for the stars anymore, but doing what has to be done to reduce suffering and save lives. And throughout the pandemic, over the last 18 months, I haven't been able to stop thinking about Roida, who I met in Tanzania on my last trip just under 2 years ago before we went into lockdown. Roida lives next to a rubbish dump, Tanzania's largest rubbish dump, and the dump is regularly set on fire. The black smoke that comes from setting the dump on fire, which is largely from single-use plastics, makes her sick, causes her to cough and have respiratory problems. She has no running water or electricity. She's raising her small children on her own. Throughout Tanzania, I saw huge billboards advertising Coke and Pepsi, and These are the types of single-use plastic that are being burned on the dump. There's no way of recycling these safely in Tanzania. As a result, people are forced to burn their waste or to put it into waterways that pollutes the ocean. Across the world, 2 billion people don't have access to waste collection, like Roida, and Tearfund estimates this leads to around 1 million deaths a year. People like Roida are at that apex of those triple threats that we've all spoken about: poverty, climate change and pollution, and now coronavirus. It was devastating to hear the decision to cut UK aid, because this has provided so much access to clean water for people like Roida, access to clean energy and support after disasters. And at Tearfund, UK aid also helped us to expand our environmental work, reducing plastic pollution in communities like Roida's. Yet, I want to speak about hope. We've talked about not being in the same boat. We've talked about people not being in a boat at all. But hope does come through a storm. Looking back at key moments in history, it's often through points of crisis that movements of people have emerged, movements of people that create change. One of the wonderful things about my job is that I get to hear about these movements of change all the time. I think about my colleague Simona in Brazil, who is leading a movement of churches, scientists, people who are lobbying government, taking action in their own communities, reducing plastic pollution. I think of Charles, who leads the Malawi Creation Care Network, one of our allies, who has campaigned tirelessly and successfully to ban thin plastics in Malawi. And I think of the Renew Our World campaign, movements of Christians now spanning 20 different countries, from Australia to India, from Peru to Mozambique, all calling for action on climate change, plastic pollution, and deforestation. And in the UK, I think about all the activists, all the normal people who are holding services all over the land in the run-up to COP, young people who are walking from Cornwall to Glasgow in time for the summit, which is part of the Young Christians Climate Network, which we've supported alongside Christian Aid. There is so much hope, and these movements for change have led to change, concrete policy changes and transformation within communities. Charles from the Malawi Creation Network said, "I and thousands of Malawians are playing our part to tackle this unfolding climate disaster. And we need world leaders to get the job done at the Glasgow climate talks." Across the world, people are playing their part. So what does getting the job done look like? In summary, we need to keep pushing for a 1.5 degree world. We need to end the era of fossil fuels at home and abroad. And we need to deliver that climate finance to help countries adapt. And we need a green and healthy recovery from the pandemic for everyone. And this should be reflected in the UK's policies domestically and internationally on aid and trade and the environment. This is a moment to step forward, to play our part in the story of restoration. And as my colleague Kuki Rokem, our partner Ethical in India, has said, the time to act was yesterday, but we still have today. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, well, thank you to all of our panel. Now it's over to you for questions to the panel. I'm going to ask you to please keep your questions to sentences rather than paragraphs, and please make sure they end with a question mark. I'm going to take them two at a time, and then we can get through a few more. So there's one here, Michael and Tracy, and then one there. And there'll be several more rounds of questions after, so you will get another chance.
How smooth of you.
things fixed. I mean, back in the day when I was growing up, if your TV broke, you could go and get it fixed. I'm not saying, you know, everyone wants to do that, but actually, because things are just so easily accessible and probably much cheaper, it just means you just throw them away. And, you know, and that's the kind of culture we've really got ourselves into. I think most of us were really angry when we saw what happened in Scotland with Amazon disposing so much, you know, of the goods that actually so many people in this country could have made good use of. But this sense that businesses, just for them, it means very little. I think, you know, there's got to be a sense of responsibility, and this requires us to almost take a real rethink about education, because, you know, climate isn't something you're interested in. And it isn't something that's quite niche. Actually affects all our lives. It's going to affect the next generation and our children. And so how do we actually educate young people as to what it means? Because if I'm honest, we're not having this conversation. The government's really worried about the political, you know, fallout in respect of actually certain parts of the country not understanding actually why we've got to take climate action, what kind of transitions we are going to have to make. And therefore, I think it's so important we educate ourselves, because actually we can all do something at home, as little as it is. And if we want to show the rest of the world that sense of solidarity, it's got to be that local to global link, and really having some humility and saying, actually, we are going to play our part in making sure that we do everything we possibly can. And it is not just you. And I think this is going to take leadership from government. It's going to be rethinking how we do stuff, how our high streets are being used, what kind of things we want to see. And that means much broader engagement. So I've taken a bit of time to answer the question, but I think you're absolutely right. We have got to play our part.
Thank you. Andrew, thank you for your comment there. World Vision, we wholeheartedly endorse it. We see children being exploited in this fast fashion disposable clothes so much. Once again, it is the weakness that bear the burden, and those who frequently have no voices to speak up for themselves. So thank you for that. Let me take James's point about carbon offset. James, carbon offset, I think my sense is that you and I would be very aligned on this. Carbon offset is not as good as carbon reduction. It is essentially passing the buck. And we have to look at the issues of carbon reduction. If I can just bring it down to a tiny little thing, something that we're doing in World Vision, which is we've revised our international travel policy completely. And we've said, we've learned new ways of doing things through lockdown, and our solution no longer is to leap on a plane, even when that's allowed. We will be reducing that. I think we, in a sense, we have to walk the talk first. And we as NGOs are very good sometimes at talking the talk and not as good at walking the walk. And this is a really simple, practical step that we're going to take, we've committed to. So thank you so much for highlighting that particular point.
Jennifer and Claire, do either of you have anything on either of those questions?
Sorry, Jennifer and I are sharing the mic, so I just wanted to really support that point around lifestyle change and waste. And as an organisation, we've done quite a bit of work on waste with our rubbish campaign that we are running. We ask people to take a lifestyle action, so taking a plastic pledge to reduce their plastic, alongside calling on companies and governments to make changes. And we think that's really important, like the living differently part. That's how we see change happening. You know, when we take these steps as citizens, as individuals, in our churches, in our local communities, it starts to change what's normal. It starts to change our values, and it opens up that political space in which then helps and supports politicians and other decision makers to be able to act. So I think it's really important. The first step we must always take is to think about reduction. How can we reduce the waste that we're creating and the burden on the earth and on the people who produce these things as well?
Great, thanks. Before I ask Jen to ask on those or to respond to those questions, I'm going to take another round of questions so the microphones can be in place. There's one at the back there, one here, and one here at the front. And I think we'll have time for one more round, so please do be thinking. Great.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask Jen to respond to those ones first. The microphone got there quicker than I was imagining it might. So,
you'll be pleased to know I don't have much more to add to what my colleagues have said. And thank you so much for bringing up the points around disposable fashion and carbon offsets. I suppose the only point I would want to emphasise is the responsibility of big corporations and the responsibility that governments have to press corporations to make those changes. And absolutely, we agree and want to see individuals make those changes at a local level, but we must keep our eye on the power that big governments have. And often, a lot of these corporations are based in the richest countries in the world, and they have a responsibility to press corporations to make the changes necessary. Thank you.
Thanks. So we'll start at the back there, and then here, and then here.
Hi, Adam, I work for Friends of the Earth. I just wanted to ask about UKEF, so UK Export Finance. So they're currently sort of funding liquid gas drilling in Mozambique around $1 billion, and that's fueling a lot of like local conflict and human rights abuses. And that's like a decision that the government is taking like right now to continue to fund this when they could withdraw the funding whenever they wanted, really. So I just wanted to ask like how we can really effectively hold the government and UKEF to account for these decisions that they're continuing to take, and they don't seem to be having that much political ramifications, sort of like continuing to support the project.
Great, thanks.
My name is Barry. I'd like to ask Preet Gill whether she supports the debt relief program proposed by Christian Aid. Is that a Labour Party policy, or is it something that's being discussed? I think it's an excellent idea, and I'd like to see Labour doing that. Thank you.
Great, and then one more just down the front here.
Hi, I was just going to ask about like what specific things can we do as individuals and as a country in government as well? What specific tools can we use at our disposal to change the mindsets of climate deniers internationally?
Great. I'm going to come to this side of the panel first for their thoughts on those three questions, saving one specifically to Preet for afterwards. Claire and Jen, any thoughts on any combination of those three questions?
Yeah, really quickly, thank you so much for bringing up the point about UK export finance. As I understand it, the UK government said that they would stop funding fossil fuels abroad. They made that promise a year ago. We're waiting for the implementation, and we find ourselves often waiting for the implementation of promises and announcements by the UK government. So you're right to absolutely bring that up, and that's one of the campaign issues that the Christian Aid remains campaigning on and calling on the government to deliver on that promise. And quickly on what we can do to change the minds of climate deniers. As a Christian, I first say pray, because the reality is that climate denial is one of the worst denials I think we could, see and recognise, given that it's so clear and so obvious, the pain and suffering that climate breakdown causes to people and communities in developing countries. And I just often wonder why we have to still make the argument for climate change when it's so obvious and so visible to so many people. So prayer is a key act for Christian Aid. Often with our campaigns, we say pray, act, and give. So prayer is where I would start. Acting is where I would take us next. And it's really, really important that people like you and I are at events like this today, but also are finding ways to act in our local communities, act amongst our families, talk to people, convince people that climate change is the biggest challenge facing our humanity. And I would say get involved as well with campaigns that raise awareness about the climate crisis. There's so much that Christian Aid and other great charities based here in the UK are doing. There's also so much that's happening abroad that you could support here in the UK. So those would be my three things to do to convince climate deniers, a big task of the challenge we face today.
Great.
Thought that was a really excellent answer by Jennifer. I guess just to add, in terms of export finance, I mean, that is correct that the UK government have agreed to stop that, to put a stop to that, but I understand there are a number of loopholes. So yes, we need to just ensure that we are kind of pressing, and we're part of a similar coalition that's continuing to press around that and make sure we close those loopholes. And also I think COP is a really key opportunity as well, because obviously with the UK taking this step, other nations have started to follow suit, which is great, but we really need that policy to be internationalised. That needs to be something that all countries commit to stopping that funding of fossil fuels overseas. So keeping the pressure up ahead of COP and at COP, and asking the government to make an announcement to try and get people around the table on that, I think is really important. And I think when it comes to climate denial, I guess, it's a challenge. And I guess most of us here in this room today are probably on a similar page with what we need to do and why we need to take action on climate change. I think one of the ways is just talking about it. We need to just have these conversations and also explain why it's important to us, and telling stories as well. I think is just something extra I'd add maybe to what Jennifer has said, praying, telling stories, taking personal action, and that can be a really powerful way of dealing with that too.
Thanks. Preet, not to put you too much on the spot, but would you like to respond to the question on climate relief and debt relief?
Yeah, I mean, on the first point about investment in oil and gas, I mean, we've been holding the government to account, whether it's at the dispatch box, whether it's tabling parliamentary questions, time and time again, asking government. And of course, what do? The thing that they do best is they make the commitments, make a headline and do nothing, actually. So 3 to 4 times they've come to the dispatch box and said, oh, yes, of course, we are now going to stop any investment. But actually, we still see oil and gas investments taking place. And we've still seen the investment in, in fossil fuels. And it's just really quite shameful, because when you are chair of COP26 and you are trying to have credibility on the world stage, you come across very hypocritical when you're asking other countries least responsible for the climate disaster to then actually make those commitments themselves, especially when they haven't got the investment in renewables, for example, or they can't make the just transitions, they don't have the finance. And we will continue to keep speaking out and holding them to account, even though they avoid answering questions. You may have seen some of the responses back to the PQs. They're really utterly shameful, and they don't want to actually be held to account. There's no transparency really from this government in terms of what it is doing. And the hypocrisy on the debt relief, I haven't seen Christian Aid's policy, but I can tell you what Labour's policy is. Labour's policy is absolutely we must end debt for the developing world. And we've been pushing right from the outset of this pandemic, saying that actually we needed to end debt. We need not just countries, but of course with private sector. And, the G20 has given a moratorium till the end of the year, but that's it. It just seems to kick the can down the road, and we've got to do much more than this, especially when we think about, building back the recovery. For many of these countries, it is going to be devastating. And if debt is still the thing that they are having to focus their energies on, I just think it's deeply disturbing, and we've got to do more, and we've got to hold the government to account and keep pushing on this. In respect to climate deniers, I mean, like with vaccines, I mean, when you don't have clear leadership and a clear communication strategy, then you are opening yourself up to lots of people taking up that space and sharing information. And of course, this comes back to the point, if we don't educate people and we don't tell them what it actually means and give them the evidence, we have fantastic institutions in this country. They ought to be partnering up some of our universities with our schools, making sure everybody really understands the importance of climate and how they can make a difference, and actually showing the evidence and the source of the evidence, because it's important. People rightfully challenge and ask, because actually we don't always sort of say, where has this information come from? How do we make it credible but make it friendly? And again, it's about jargonistic language. We alienate so many people in the country when we talk about climate, because we make it sound like it's something for the middle classes, that actually most working class people don't understand what the terminology that we use. And we've really got to start simplifying how we engage people. And actually there's an opportunity, because there's an opportunity to create jobs. If we think about retrofitting homes, if we think about the electric infrastructure that we need, if we're going to make the transition to electric vehicles, these are all things that people can get behind, but it's how that message is absolutely conveyed. And in terms of holding the government to account, we have absolutely got to mobilise support. We've got to work together collectively. In silos, we can't do it alone. I mean, this is a government that's got an 80 majority. The opposition can't do it alone. We are absolutely committed to holding the government to account, especially in terms of decimating DFID, especially in terms of slashing aid in the middle of a pandemic, not carrying out impact assessments. This is a government that doesn't care. It doesn't care because under its watch, people have died. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do about it? Because if you're looking to me and our team, it isn't just going to be us and political parties in the House. And there is support across party, of course there is. And you have seen the voices, even within the Conservative Party, speak up and hold the government to account. But again, they are being silenced. Now we have Liz Truss. We don't know what she's going to do. And certainly we know there'll be a shift away from poverty. This government doesn't really know what it wants to do or where it wants to do development. We have really got to hold it to account because it matters. Our position in the world matters. And at the moment, we're acting like a very small country who doesn't have the solutions to the very big problems. And that is not what Britain is about, because actually we were respected on the world stage and we've got to get back to that place. So I urge you all, write to your MPs, encourage your family, your friends, and don't stop. Don't stop, because there's never going to be an opportunity until we get to the next election and we see what's in manifestos. We need these commitments from every single party and every single MP. Thank you.
Thank you, Preet. Mark, do you have anything final to add to those?
I'm taking a hint to be very brief there, and I have very little to add. It started us off brilliantly, and Preet just concluded it in the middle of the great stuff as well. The only thing, pray, act, give, absolutely. And in the right order as well, thank you. And the only other thing I would say is, echoing what Preet was just saying, we've got to join our voices together. Let us move as a holistic movement and really hold this government to account. And I would say one thing, and I know Claire and Jennifer would agree with this. As INGOs, we have a very particular little place. We do get invited in to see government ministers and talk to government ministers. And the more we can say, we are not talking with just the voice of Mark Sheard or Jennifer or Claire, but we're speaking with the voice of 1 million people who are arguing this and calling you to account, then it has more impact. So please let us engage together and really hold this government to account for some of the terrible things that are happening. Abdication of responsibility on the world stage.
Thank you. I think that we are getting towards the end of our time, so I will call a halt there. But thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to Emily, to Preet, to Mark, to Jen and to Claire. Thank you to you also for coming. Those of you who have been in the main hall at all or in the conference centre will know that the 3 words that are defining much of the policy debate this week are stronger, future, together. I can't think of a particular area where that is more true than on the conversation that we've had tonight. And so you don't need me to tell you that the conversation doesn't end here. It doesn't end with this panel. It continues to COP, but it continues for the organisations represented here. So it leaves me to say, if you're interested in continuing this conversation, do look at the work of World Vision, of Christian Aid and the Tearfund. Do consider joining both Sarah and Christians on the Left, and join us for our fringe events the rest of this week. But consider joining as members as well, and please don't let this be the end of the conversation. But thank you to you and thank you to our panel. That's the end of our conversation tonight.